Welcome to the American Diversity Report podcast, where we interview great change makers and creative innovators. I'm Deborah Levine, the editor of the American Diversity Report and your podcast host. And with me today is Avi Hoffman, who was recently awarded congressional recognition, was invited to the Vatican to meet Pope Francis, and was inducted into the Bronx Jewish Hall of Fame for his lifetime work advancing Jewish culture, Yiddish language, and Holocaust awareness. He is a globally renowned award-winning actor, director, and producer, and co-founder and CEO of Yiddishkeit Initiative, Inc. That's why I love Jewish.org. And it's a nonprofit organization dedicated to fighting anti-Semitism through the arts. Yiddish saves the world.
Ah, what a pleasure to be here, Deborah. Thank you.
Oh, what fun. Tell us a little bit about yourself. But first, explain what is Yiddish and
I,
how
I
do you
mean,
know so much?
it's fascinating. Most people don't realize how much Yiddish they know because there are thousands of Yiddish words that have become part of the English language, whether it's shtick or schmaltz or schmear. SH alone is probably several hundred words. Yiddish is over 1,000 years old, and those who do know about it know that it's basically a Jewish language that was created in the upper mountains of Germany over 1,000 years ago. It's based in German, but the Jews who were speaking it wanted to differentiate themselves from the others around them. And so they incorporated a lot of the biblical Hebrew that they used to pray. Hebrew, of course, is a holy tongue and was not allowed to be used in daily language. So they took the Hebrew, they incorporated the German, and then they also brought in words from all the different languages that they spoke from all over the world. Russian and all the Slavic languages, the Latin languages. So there are elements in Yiddish from most of the linguistic root languages. It's a fusion language, just like every other language. It had its ups, it had its downs, mostly in the last 2 centuries, or actually the last century and a half. It's been on a downward trajectory. Many people have been prophesizing the death of Yiddish for hundreds of years, but luckily Yiddish never dies. Like the phoenix, it always rises from the ashes, literally, of the Holocaust, where half the Yiddish-speaking community of Europe was murdered. Yiddish is a beautifully expressive language which, after 1,000 years, never had a home. It was very Hamish because it was spoken in many Jewish homes around the world, millions of homes, mine included. My parents both spoke Yiddish. Yiddish was my first language. They were both survivors of the Holocaust who dedicated their lives to preserving the language and the culture that Hitler wanted to destroy. And my mother was a professor of the Yiddish language and culture at Columbia University for 25 years. My father was involved as a chairman of the YIVO organization, the largest depository of Eastern European archive artifacts in the world. And so I grew up totally embodied with this language, with the culture. And I indeed started my career as an actor professionally in the Yiddish theater in New York when I was 10 years old. And I've been doing Yiddish and Hebrew and English ever since. And 7 years ago, my mother and I founded the Yiddishkeit Initiative, which we branded as YI, lovejewish.org. And what we're trying to, basically bring to the world is the beauty and the depth and the richness of this amazing language and culture and people. The Jewish people have survived for thousands of years and contributed so much to the world's mainstream culture. We don't even realize how much of what we think of today as mainstream, movies, music, comedy, theater, all really began their journeys in the Yiddish speaking world of the turn of the 20th century, the 1880s to the 1940s.
Yes, indeed. Well, you've been very fortunate. My dad, I'm sure he grew up speaking Yiddish, but his family made a different decision, right? He said, "I'm an American boy. I'm going to speak American." Yeah, exactly. Until until somebody really riled him, and then he kind of punted to Yiddish. And it was funny because a lot of it was over my daughter, right? And she she could get under his skin. Even
Mm,
as a little baby,
right.
he started yelling at me, "Your daughter has a big pisk." I didn't know what that was. I had to look it up because I had not heard the Yiddish. I wish
Right.
I had. I really envy you.
Well, thank you. I mean, I'm very privileged that way, and I feel less like one of the last of the Mohicans nowadays, because I have been personally privy to what I believe is a global renaissance of Yiddish language and culture. It's been an extraordinary journey. Because I've been so involved in this world all my life, and I'm not a young man anymore, I can look back at the last 4 or 5 decades and see how the status of Yiddish has changed significantly. I just got back from Sweden about 5 weeks ago, where to my incredible amazement and shock, I learned that Yiddish has been named an official national minority language of Sweden. Now,
Wow.
I mentioned earlier that Yiddish didn't have a home for 1,000 years. One of the very distinctive qualities of the Yiddish language was that it never had a home. It never was a country. It was never associated with any country. Polish, yes, all the Jews spoke Yiddish, or most of them, but the language in Poland was Polish. French, there were plenty of Yiddish speaking Jews in France, but French was the language of France. Yiddish was spoken all over the world, but never had a home. And then the government of Sweden, after being petitioned by the Jewish community of Sweden, which apparently has been there for 250 years and have become so a part of Swedish society, that Sweden asked for proposals to name several languages official minority languages of Sweden. Among them were Roma, what was once the Gypsy languages, Finnish. Finnish is very close to Sweden, Finland, and a lot of Finns moved to Sweden and brought their language, and that has now become Taladarian. I mean, there are all these languages I never heard of, and Yiddish.
I love
It
it.
was it was a very difficult journey. Um, when I went to Sweden for this international Yiddish conference, I was invited. I brought along a student from the University of Miami, where I am now embedded. to document the trip. So we're now creating a documentary film about Yiddish in Sweden. And it's fascinating. It's really quite stunning. But it's not even just Sweden. There are movies being made in Yiddish by young people all over the world. There are television series being made in Yiddish, one of which just received the Cannes Festival Award for Best TV Series. It's a German television series called The Zweiflers or Zweiflers. And it's
That
in
mean?
oh God, I don't remember, but it's a German word. Um, but that's their family name apparently.
Okay, that's fine.
And but it's mostly in Yiddish because it talks about a couple of Holocaust survivors who built their lives in Germany after the war and became successful, and how their journey, but it's in Yiddish mostly, not only, not exclusively. It's got German and French and Italian and English, but it is fascinating for me after 50 years professionally in the business to be able to see this global expansion of the use of the Yiddish language, the recognition of the Yiddish language, and it blows my mind to think that we have a home for the first time in history, and in all places, in Sweden.
So how do people learn to speak or to understand Yiddish these days? Where do they go?
Well, the same way it's always been. There are schools that teach Yiddish. At this point, mostly university level and higher. Although, again, having said that, what I'm now learning more and more in Mexico, in Argentina, in Bolivia, in Colombia, in Brazil, there are, and Toronto, in Montreal, and now in Israel again for the first time in a long time, in Australia, there are Yiddish schools. And in Sweden, part of Sweden determining that Yiddish is a national minority language means that any student in any school in Sweden can request to learn Yiddish and has to be provided a curriculum and a teacher
I love it. I love it. My
because it's a
goodness.
national language. So there are now young people in Sweden and in all those other countries that I mentioned who are learning Yiddish in schools. Now, granted, it's not what it used to be. When I was growing up in the 1960s, and if you go back to the 1950s and 40s, before the State of Israel, there were thousands and thousands and thousands of Yiddish schools all over the world. There were several networks of Yiddish schools. There was the Shulam Aleichem Volksschule Institute. There was the Albertering. There were the Bund schools. There were several systems within which Yiddish was taught on a daily basis. These were dailies. I used to go to Yiddish school every single day after public school when I was a kid. And so that was then. Needless to say, by the time the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, Hebrew had become, Judaism had become Hebrew centric and Israel centric.
Yes.
After the Holocaust, Yiddish became associated with victimhood, and you didn't want to talk that language. And oi, that's for old people. Yiddish is dead. Yiddish is dying. Oi, what do you say? You only talk Yiddish when you don't want the kids to understand. Um, so just as always, there are academic outlets for people to learn Yiddish. There are online Duolingo. You can now learn Yiddish on Duolingo, which
Duolingo.
Duolingo is an online language learning application. I think it's free, and you could learn any language. And
Hmm.
it's a very easy system. They've started a Yiddish program in Duolingo. So those who heard it at home, those whose grandparents spoke it or parents spoke it, certainly most of the Holocaust survivors and their children, some of their grandchildren, speak it. But what I'm finding fascinating is that it's no longer dependent on people speaking and understanding the language. What do I mean by that? Opera. Opera is a wonderful medium. People love the opera. I would venture to say that many of the people who go to the opera do not understand the words that are being sung.
Probably true.
No, I know this for a fact. So they go to enjoy the experience of the opera and they get to read the titles. A very dear friend of mine, someone who I've known for a long time, who is in the world of promoting opera, came to see Death of a Salesman in Yiddish off Broadway in New York that I did many years ago, about 9 years ago. And he said to me, Yiddish theater is the new opera
Ooh, wow.
because you don't need to understand a word, and yet it becomes an experience that you cannot forget. And so nowadays, you've got filmmakers, young filmmakers in their 20s and 30s, who don't understand a word of Yiddish, but they write a movie in English and then have it translated into Yiddish because they want it to be done in Yiddish.
I love it.
So I am, I never thought I would live to see the day that Yiddish would truly benefit from this kind of a global. I see it all over the world. It's all through Europe. I mean, Sweden. How much more Goyish can you get than Sweden, really? But there it was.
I'm so delighted to hear this because even though I didn't grow up speaking Yiddish, like you said in the very beginning, there were many, many Yiddish words that were part of my childhood. I just didn't realize it was Yiddish. I thought, "No, this is how people, they speak." And I didn't realize that going like this was kind of a Yiddish thing until I gave a presentation at a national conference for Seventh-day Adventists. And I was behind the pulpit talking and going, hmm. And when they put out the magazine about the conference, it was a picture of me on the front cover going, hmm. You didn't need any words to go
Right,
with it, right?
right.
Because
Yeah,
it's so expressive. It goes with the facial expressions, the hands, the arms, the shoulder, everything. It's part, of a complete language, verbal and nonverbal. And that's what makes it so amazing.
right. I
Mhm.
mean, and again, I think, most people don't know the extent of the Yiddish culture. They know Yiddish, yeah, the old people spoke it, these people spoke it, the Holocaust survivors spoke it. Oh, when you want to laugh, you tell a joke. Oh, it's in Yiddish, it sounds like Yiddish, you talk with an accent, it's funny. They don't realize that 1,000 years of literature, 1,000 years of culture, 1,000 years of poetry and music and theater, um, the richness, the quality. Yiddish was eventually recognized with Isaac Bashevis Singer receiving the Nobel Prize. But there were many writers who wrote in Yiddish who were not recognized. They were nominated or they were considered for many prizes, But we have Shakespeare's in Yiddish. I give a lecture called Our Yiddish Shakespeare's.
Oh. And who
And
are they?
people like Chaim Grade, who interestingly enough was up for the Nobel Prize the same year that Isaac Bashevis Singer was. But because Bashevis was translated into English and Grade's work was not, they ended up giving the prize to Bashevis. Grade never recovered from that. But his work is considered with some of the greatest literary figures in the world, including Shakespeare, Kadia Molodovsky, Avrom Sutzkever, people you've never heard of, which to me is really this is the true sin of this discussion, is if you had a treasure and you yourself decided to hide the treasure somewhere, bury it somewhere in the ground, and forget about it. And then you forget that you even have the treasure, nor do you remember where you buried it. This is basically where we are today when it comes to the Yiddish language and culture. There are treasures that have been lost to generations. And through the work of wonderful organizations like the National Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts, where they are now digitizing and translating thousands and thousands of Yiddish books that have been discarded or lost, and they are bringing them back. The
Wow.
work we're doing with Yiddishkeit Initiative, the Yiddish theater Fiddler on the Roof in Yiddish was in New York. It was a huge hit. But that was only the culmination of several years of Death of a Salesman in Yiddish, Waiting for Godot in Yiddish. And going back, as you go back in time, you see that Shakespeare was done in Yiddish. Yiddish theater was the foundation of everything we think of today in terms of theater, because there was no Broadway. There was Yiddish theater, dozens of them all over the world. And so the works of Shakespeare were done in Yiddish, translated and improved sometimes. Um, but we are only now discovering or rediscovering as a society, as a globe, this little, unique little world that the Jewish people created 1,000 years ago and kept it and survived with it. I think of it as the language and culture of survival. And I'm very excited to see how so many people now all over the world want to know more.
Well, I want to share with you how much I thank you for singing to me for my birthday.
Uh,
That the Yiddish version of Happy Birthday on my phone. It was such a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to more, to helping in any way I can to educate people, to get the word out of what's available and how they can kind of get in touch with it and enjoy it themselves. And you do have the whyilovejewish.org website. You are up on Facebook. There are lots of ways for people to get in touch and to get more information.
Absolutely.
It's,
And we
yeah.
are now creating a concerted effort to do outreach to communities all around the country where we can provide them with programming. We can do lectures about our Yiddish Shakespeares if they like. There's a beautiful concert that I've done called God and the Holocaust. which basically explores how the great Jewish writers and poets who survived the Holocaust, how did they reconcile themselves with the horror of that enormous magnitude that was the Holocaust? And so, where was God? Suddenly, the questions of God, and where was God during the Holocaust? And how could a God allow a Holocaust? And some kept their faith and made it even stronger. And for some, it was a loss of faith, like my father. My father came from a very religious little shtetl in the Carpathian Mountains. And after Auschwitz, he said, there is no God. There cannot be a God who would allow that to happen. And so, there are as many attitudes as there are people, as there are Jews in this particular case.
And
But
many of us struggle still.
but we can bring these struggles, we can bring these conversations to anywhere now, whether it's online. Our YouTube channel, our YI YouTube channel, has over 250 free programs that people can watch, including our Yiddish Shakespeare's and God and the Holocaust, and the fun celebrating Yinglish. Yinglish
Of it.
is that wonderful combination of Yiddish and English that has become part of the English language. There are thousands of words that are part of the English language that came from Yiddish. So I do a very sweet and funny lecture all about those words that have become so much a part of English that some people don't even realize.
And that's up on YouTube?
That
That
is also on YouTube.
all
Yes.
right. Okay. Now I'm
Yes.
going to have to go see that one for sure. And audience, you hear me now?
Uh,
It's not like there'll be a test, sort of, but you need to go watch this to understand not just Jewish culture, but American culture, the world culture of how it has developed, of how things get lost, but how things can be recovered. And that's what Avi is trying to do and doing so amazingly. And I am so grateful to have this time to talk with you, Avi, about it. And I know we've got to wrap up soon, but will you please stay on after we close this? I have a few things to ask you, and
sure.
I'm sure that my audience does too. So know that this interview will have its own page where people can post comments and
Mm,
questions, and I'll share them with you so that you can answer them, because I
thank you.
think that this will be an ongoing conversation for sure.
I hope so.
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, so thank you very much. And audience, stay in touch. Okay.